Hey, welcome to the Big Me Kickoff. I'm your host, Kevin Noon. It is Friday, January 28th. Where's the month of January gone? I don't believe we've already made it through this month. We're a couple days away from National Signing Day. It will not be a huge one for Ohio State. A couple players will sign that we already know about. Kristen Miller is really the one big unsigned player out there on Ohio State's board. That one seems to be slipping away. I guess then again, if you say slipping away, that means that you are insinuating you had him at some point. Uh, Kristen could really end up anywhere, but we shall see. We will talk about that a little bit more next week when we talk about recruiting. That is not on the docket for today's show. A quick Friday update as it is cold and some snow on the ground here in Ohio. Those of you in the northeast of the country, especially around New York, buckle up for what could be an interesting weekend with a nor'easter. That great report of New York could get between 2 and 20 inches of snow. Well, there's a chance I could drink 2 or 20, between 2 and 20 beers this weekend. You just don't know. So, way to cover all of your bases. But I get it. You don't understand what's going to happen. Nor'easters are pretty crazy. I lived up in New Hampshire for a couple years. You just don't know what you're going to get. Obviously, when I lived up there, computers were not necessarily a huge thing in terms of the personal computing market, so we didn't have websites like that, and you just kind of got what you got. And if WMUR out of Manchester didn't tell you what your weather was, then you didn't know what you were going to get. But enough of all of that. Let's get into news that Ohio State fans care about, and we'll start with the report out of The Athletic by Scott Docterman out of the Iowa market about the conference looking at potentially going from 9 games to 8 games, doing away with divisions, 3 protected rivals, top 2 teams would play in the championship game. Now, I had the opportunity to talk with Tom Orr about that on the Morning Scoop this week. I know that Tom and Tony talked about it on Buckeye Weekly. There's been a lot of talk about it. I haven't had a chance to kind of talk about it on my own. I don't know how I feel about this. Part of the plan would be this unsigned alliance with the ACC and the Pac-12 to play an alliance game instead of that conference game. And I do agree to a certain extent that you learn more about your teams by playing non-conference foes than you do playing conference foes, because it's a beauty contest when it comes to the college football playoff selection committee. And how are you truly going to know how certain teams stack up if they're not playing a lot of marquee names outside of their conference? Ohio State, that's not been an issue. Ohio State has Notre Dame on its schedule this year, upcoming year. We'll talk about Notre Dame in a minute. Certainly has series against Oregon, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Boston College, so on and so forth. Ohio State has not moved away from scheduling at least one hammer on its schedule in most years. Michigan, on the other hand, has a horrible schedule for the next 2 years in terms of non-conference. Sisters of the Poor, Cousins of the Poor, and Daughters of the Poor seem to be on the Michigan Wolverines schedule for non-conference games. So you don't necessarily have equality there within your conference, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's suddenly going to happen if you do this alliance deal with the other conferences, where one team could sit there and be drawing Clemson or USC. Another team could end up drawing, I don't know, NC State or Washington State. And while Washington State or NC State still might be better than a low FBS team, are they going to get credit for playing that team the same way that another team might get credit for playing, again, the USCs of the world, Utah, who, obviously Ohio State played in the Rose Bowl, the more of the higher end teams? And how do you determine this? I mean, obviously it's going to have to be something done at the conference level. It's not going to be you're supposed to go and schedule somebody from one of these conferences, have at it. You just can't do that. So I don't know. And the Big Ten tried to get into, I mean, and technically was briefly in a scheduling arrangement with the Pac-12 many years ago. Forced Ohio State to drop. Well, it didn't force. Ohio State chose to drop series against Tennessee and Georgia because of it, because we were going to pick up all these Pac-12 games. And then, of course, that fell apart. The conference moves to 9 games under Jim Delaney, and those series had fallen off the schedule. All of this, I think, is in a reaction to the SEC going to 14, adding Texas and Oklahoma whenever that may be, 23, 24, 25, 26. The Big Ten television deal is coming up. We're at the very end of it. So they're at the renegotiation table. You know, these things don't happen 6 weeks before the contract ends. You got to get it set up. There's certainly the debate that CBS is trying to enter, because CBS is losing the SEC. SEC is going to go home to ABC, ESPN. Therefore, it would make sense for somebody who's got half of their deal with ABC, ESPN to find a new suitor. Now, Fox already pays the larger end of the deal under the current situation and gets some benefits in terms of how the contract works, in terms of first picks and things of that nature. CBS isn't necessarily looking to add 4 games a week in terms of football. So CBS is going to be looking to put a marquee game in that 3:30 window Eastern, whereas Fox likes big noon. But you're going to have to do that. So you're going to need to have some additional inventory to get as much money as you can out of that deal, because we know that the Big Ten certainly did not have an aggressive approach to conference expansion. Whether or not you believe that the SEC completely operated in the shadows in terms of Texas and Oklahoma, you know, I just think I hate constantly being super critical of conference leadership, but they make it so easy. I think that the Big Ten was focused on all of the wrong things while that was going on. While the Big Ten was not revisiting playing football in 2020, the SEC was out there playing 5D chess while the Big Ten was playing checkers, and goes out and gets the 2 biggest names out there. And now you're dealing with a situation of where all the conferences have grant of rights locked in for however many years, and everybody's like, well, we'll just go cannibalize the ACC, just cannibalize the Big 12. Well, the Big 12 has announced its expansion, and it, of course, it's having to step down and get teams that were Group of 5, Cincinnati namely. But how do you, in lieu of expanding your conference, which isn't always just about football, which isn't always about athletics. I mean, you're dealing with millions of dollars on the athletic side. You're dealing with billions of dollars on the academic side in terms of the Big Ten Alliance, which used to be the CIC, with grants and everything else that goes on there. So it's not as simple as saying, well, we just really want to put a couple more football teams in there. And it makes even less sense when people are like, well, the Big Ten should just go grab Kansas, because that means something for basketball. I like college basketball. Don't get me wrong. You may like college basketball, but college basketball does not have the same draw that college football has, and college football is still a drop in the bucket compared to all the other dollars that are involved in terms of expansion. So going in and capturing Kansas, a basketball program that still has a black cloud around it, a football program that outside of beating Texas can't do much. It doesn't get you any new real television markets that you're not already in at this point. Makes zero sense. So to me, it feels like that this is a proactive move by the conference to try and shake some things up. But that doesn't mean that these 3 conferences that have no signed contracts, mind you, there's nothing binding there. Well, we don't need any of that. Oh, really? That doesn't mean that all of them are working toward becoming a super conference or something like that. You're going to have all 3 conference structures still in place. You're going to have all 3 conference bureaucracies still in place. The one thing I do like about this is that it gets everybody in line for playing 8 games. But I don't know if 8 games in terms of conference games is the right number. But it's everybody needs to be at 9, everybody needs to be at 8. I understand that you need to have home date inventory to keep the trains running. Football pays for almost everything else athletically. We just know that. Ohio State has 36, 37 Division One sports. I mean, it takes a lot of money to keep everything moving, and only football and men's basketball really operate making a profit. I think women's basketball is pretty close. I haven't seen the numbers in the last couple of years. And then you got a lot of other sports that are operating at deficits. And you're not dealing with full scholarships there. I mean, you have sports that get to split 6 scholarships, so you have guys and gals getting a half scholarship, a quarter scholarship, what have you, to try and stretch that out. So, back to the point, does if we have this move where the Big Ten goes to 8 league games with no conferences, 3 protected rivals, top 2 teams play, does that make the does that make the Big Ten competitive with the SEC in terms of what the product is? Does that help? Does that hurt? What do the TV stations think about it? What do the TV networks think about it? Is that a big enough plum to sit there and get a better deal? I mean, the Big Ten, at least under Jim Delaney, had the wherewithal to say, we want our deal to come up first. We want to be the ones who kind of set the market. I mean, you have other conferences that don't have their TV deals coming up until the 2030s. So, I mean, there's something there, but I don't know if the Big Ten is necessarily making itself any more attractive to the College Football Playoff Committee by saying, well, we're adding another game against a high, a Power 5 team through the alliance. It does make a little bit of sense, though, when you look at how Kevin Warren has really kind of dug his heels in terms of, whether it's automatic qualifiers for conference champions or what have you. And something that I talked about with Tom Oregon on the Morning Scoop is, what happens if Ohio State and Michigan end up being the top 2 teams and have to play each other back-to-back weeks? And what happens if you know that going into, quote-unquote, the game on the home campus of either Ohio State or Michigan, and you're going to play them next week in Indianapolis or Chicago or Detroit or wherever they might end up moving the game to on a rotating basis because they're just bound and determined to make things less awesome in the Big Ten. Do you sit there, and if you have somebody who's questionable for the first go-round, with the second go-round meaning so much more, meaning potentially an automatic berth, meaning whatever, how do you handle that? How do you have 2 game plans? I mean, your personnel is your personnel. You've already put 11 games on tape. So, you can make some tweaks, but you're not you are who you are. It's hard to beat a team twice. I mean, we did see Utah beat Oregon twice in 3 weeks, but everything was on the line at that point based on the divisional structure of the Pac-12. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? The more I talk it through, the more I don't like it. And I know that in Scott Docterman's article, a lot of details weren't fleshed out yet. We don't know a lot of things there. It seems that, Gary Barta was the person who kind of was the source. I mean, that wasn't necessarily some unnamed source, the athletic director at Iowa. Is that Iowa putting it out there because it wants it out there as a positive? Is that them putting it out there hoping to get this thing railed on? I mean, they certainly have me railing on it, but again, I've not completely thought it through. So, looking for your impact, your input on this. Let me know. We can kind of talk about it next week when we do a live Big Me Kickoff. I wanted to jump to another piece that I'd done this week on week 1 games. We talk about Notre Dame. Ohio State opens with Notre Dame. Huge game at Ohio Stadium. It's a big deal. We certainly are not that far removed from Ohio State opening the season against Youngstown State or a MAC opponent. If we look about week 1 opponents being against a Power 5 team, and let's remember, in my piece I went back 40 years. I had to kind of set the number somewhere. 40 felt fine. I could have gone back 50, but again, we're also dealing with the situation of where football was very different in '82 in terms of how it was consumed. 40 years ago, People were only getting on television a little bit. I mean, it was even more different. If I would have gone back to 72, that would have been, that would have been a big dive in there. So, Ohio State since 2015 has played 5 games, 5 season openers against Power 5 teams. Ohio State, did not play against another Power 5 opener prior to that until 2003 when they played Washington and beat the Huskies 28-9. In these last 5 years, Ohio State, 3 of those games have been against conference foes. As the Big Ten Conference has said, we need to split our inventory up a little bit more. We need to have league games pretty much every week. And the Buckeyes have done that with Minnesota in 21, Nebraska in 20, which, again, 20 was a weird year, so I don't really put a lot into that one. And then 17 at Indiana. And 2 of these 3 games were on the road. But if you go back prior to 2003, there were more years than not that Ohio State did open against a Power 5 team. You open against a team that's Power 5 or considered Power 5, and because there was some crossover against playing maybe some smaller teams, but that wasn't going to be your number one. And now I do have a couple games in there against teams that are Power 5 not now, but weren't at that point or would have been considered because they were independent. And you'll say, but Kevin, Notre Dame's independent. Well, not all independents are built the same way. 92 against Louisville was independent. 88 against Syracuse was independent. WVU was independent in 87, and Pittsburgh was independent in 85. So those don't necessarily get in there. But you see games where, Ohio State in 03 against Washington, in 98 against West Virginia, who was number 11. Boston College in 95, that was at neutral site. They were 22. Ohio State's played 3 neutral site openers in New Jersey and are 1-2 in them because they also had the losses to Miami in 99 in the Kickoff Classic, and then to Alabama in 86, who was number 6 at the time. So, I don't know if Ohio State certainly, once again, needs that home inventory because that has such a huge economic impact, not only with the gate, but what it means to the university community and everything else. So we see these kickoff classics in Atlanta, and we see these kickoff classics in Dallas. And, when certainly we saw Ohio State go to Jerry World and play TCU a couple years ago, I believe it was week 3 of the season. That was in lieu of a home-and-home series that, TCU didn't necessarily want to honor both dates on that, so they just did that type of situation. And it's great if you get $5 million at the gate. That's fantastic. But again, that doesn't help. That doesn't help the varsity club. That doesn't help college traditions. That doesn't help these other places that really have a huge rake on the day of a home game. And now, kind of going back to the other situation, does it create a situation to where maybe you do some of these alliance games neutral site? Again, I don't know how you figure out the dollar figures for it to make sense, but if you have a partner like CBS, you could certainly figure some things out there. But my major point in this piece was not necessarily about the Big 10 looking at going to 8. I wrote this before I was aware of any of that. It was just more of a case of, I think we're going to see more teams having to play or choosing to play or having it chosen for them against major teams to start the season. And ultimately, I think it just needs to come down to a point of where we have some parity in terms of, all right, we're all playing 8, we're all playing 9, one or the other. We're all playing an FCS opponent. We're not playing an FCS opponent. I think that's the only way that you're going to have at least a little bit of fairness in terms of matching apples and apples, because you have all these different rules there. And you know what? If you're in a conference that it's getting away with not having to play 9, why would you move to 9? If you're getting to play the Citadel the week before your big rivalry game at the end of the season, why are you going to change? You're not going to change until you're forced to change. That's always going to be a home date, so that's going to be worth however much you get for that. That's always going to be a win. That's going to be a chance to play your starters a quarter if you have to. So why would you move that? So again, we don't have a college football commissioner or czar. I'm call me. I can handle that job easily. We don't have anybody setting those types of rules. I would hope that this talk about the college football playoff committee meeting about expansion and putting things in there, that maybe there's some minimum standards, that you have something. It's like, okay, you need to have this, you need to have that, because something else, going back to this proposed Big Ten talk, if the Big Ten doesn't have doesn't have divisions, I don't know. I don't know how they're necessarily going to be able to set things up in terms of how they're going to pot it with, okay, these are the three teams that you're going to play year in and year out. If Ohio State ends up getting Michigan, Michigan State, and Penn State, and then continues its aggressive scheduling and then has to play an alliance game, that's crazy. That's crazy. And that's not anything that the College Football Playoff Committee can legislate in or out or whatever. But I think that there needs to be some sort of uniform standards out there, to where if you want to be part of the discussion, you need to play X amount of conference games, X amount of games against the Power Five. I think there needs to be some things in play there, instead of teams doing, the least possible. And again, that doesn't change the fact that the ACC last year was horrible. They were horrible. Clemson kind of bounced back toward the end of the year after a horrible start. We had Wake and Pitt in the championship game. They both had prolific offenses, didn't really have a defense. And again, I know another team that we can say that about too, but it may have been even worse in those other instances. And then there was just a lot of just flyover states in the middle of that conference. It just wasn't a great conference. So what happens to that ACC team? At least that ACC team is going to be forced to play a Big Ten or Pac-12 team to kind of fatten up its schedule. And, say what you will about Clemson. Clemson isn't afraid to go out and schedule a nice non-conference game, and then always is going to have its game against South Carolina as that in-state rivalry type of game. So I don't know. I don't have all the answers to this. Just kind of getting a free flow of thoughts for me here on a Friday as we get ready for the weekend. Want to wrap up a little bit by talking about the upcoming conference championship games in the NFL. Let's start with the NFC. You got the Niners and the Rams, a West Coast matchup. Obviously, you've got Nick Bosa on the Niners. The Rams, Jordan Fuller is injured at this point, so he's not going to be able to go. I don't know. I've seen the Rams put it together and look like a team that should be competing for it all. The Niners, on the other hand, is the quarterback play going to be there? I can't believe that Jimmy Garoppolo and that effort was able to get to the conference championship game. I'm gonna take the Rams there, just because I think they're a little bit more of a known quantity. And while I don't necessarily think that Matt Stafford is fantastic, I think he's more solid than Garoppolo is. And I don't know. That's just the way I feel there. Bengals Chiefs. I'm gonna say with my heart, I want to pick the Bengals. I'm not an AFC North fan. I don't dislike any team in the AFC North. I don't like any team in the AFC North. It's not my division. I'm a Cowboys fan, as we know. So yeah, sorry. But Joe Burrow is a great story. Sam Hubbard is a great story. There's certainly some more Ohio State ties to the Bengals. And then the other side, you got the Chiefs. And I don't know about you, but I feel like we've been completely saturated with Patrick Mahomes and commercials and everything else. And boy, is his girlfriend unlikable. Yeah. I'm gonna pull for the Bengals, but I think the Chiefs they know how to win those games. Granted, the Bengals have they snapped a 31-year streak. They've won 2 now. Certainly had to win it in thrilling fashion last week. The Chiefs know how to win these types of games. I just think the Chiefs are going to be too much, but I would not be unhappy to see the Bengals. And then, so that means I would have, with my picks, I would have Chiefs and Rams. Let's just say the Rams for somebody different. Tired of the Chiefs. So there you go. Didn't really get into it too much. We can kind of talk about it as a bit of a post-mortem. Beginning of next week, we're going to do 2 shows next week. One of them will be live. I haven't decided if it'll be Monday or Friday, but I want to thank you all for being part of the show. If you have any ideas of things you'd like us to talk about, be sure to sit there and leave it in the comments, or you can email me at kevin@buckeyegrove.com. Yeah, I still have my old email address. It still works, so just hit me there. Anything you want me to talk about, and we'll go for it. So until then, talk to you soon.